Welcome to TradeTneMBI.com and an advanced view of the D Omega converted. What we're looking at here would be a typical chart. Happens to have our color trend model that goes from red trend, obviously buy signals. We're looking at a 5,000 tick bar of the ES or the E futures, the mini, and this would be typically what a day trader would use. Now, today specifically, we're going to go over just a couple of the lines here. And so to make it a little easier for us visually to see them and what we're going to be talking about, specifically will be pivots on the steel and the green lines. So for those with the indicators, it's a matter of just simply right-clicking, format it, and in the values here, we end up with the different colors, and we can just put a 0 for the ones that we don't want. So we want green, we want steel. So we'll eliminate white, and we're going to eliminate the cyan for now. And then we just push OK at the bottom. That will requalify the image, and what we're going to see are just those specific lines. And so I thought it would be good if we started right here over at our white line, and we could begin to talk about what we're looking at. And I always love to find anomalies because, as I've described the D Omega converted before, if you think of these lines in the form of a tube with these individual strings running through them, being the colored lines, you get situations where you'll get an inverse relationship to a unique situation, and this happens to be above the 13.5. Also, we get similar kind of behaviors below it, and what we look for in a pivot here is fine. It's an address that, okay, you've got an anomaly. What we're looking for next will be the next pivot. Now, normally, a lower pivot from the steel represents a short setup. At this particular point, when you're having this inverse relationship because of the move above 13.5, we expect a long move. Subsequent to that, we would also be looking at the pivot of the green to its previous pivot, which is higher, also suggests higher at that particular point. And then the next view will be to look for your next pivot. Now, in this particular case, also higher than the previous one, so you would look for a continuation of that move. Now, how is this deactivated? Well, once you achieve a point where you've moved significantly below your previous pivot, and or if your green gave you a subsequent lower pivot, you would then be looking for the effectiveness of it to end. In this particular case, we've dropped now way below. -2 is typically what I look for. And now you've formed another pivot right down here that is lower than the previous cyan one. You're still positive with your green. So at this particular point, you're saying to yourself, I just need to tighten my stop at this particular point. And as you move again, now you've acquired an additional lower pivot from the previous one. Time to be thinking, okay, I can flip or begin to at least go ahead and explore a short situation, and or at minimum have a stop very, very tight to the bottom of that low, because not going to last too much longer in this particular case. And there it goes. It begins to break down from that setup. Now, from a convenient feature, particularly when dealing with these kind of pivots, will be to create this little line. And if you go to the top of your tools, you'll find this little trend line device where you just click from one side and it goes up and down. And if you want, you can just kind of get it to where it's even. You can adjust the size of it to any length you want. Click it, and you can move it to wherever you want. And so it's a good way to visually see it. As I'm programming, I'm going to be having an alteration that will show you these pivots, where they occur, what their values are, and we'll go from there. But as we scroll along, we begin to look, and what we're going to be looking for are a couple of things. One, your bottom pivot, seeing where you return back above there, and in the green relationship, whether or not the green is on top, which would tend to be more bullish than when the steel is on top, would tend to be a little bit more in a bearish configuration. And you can see again, we're making lower pivots within these setups, and it's coincidental in this particular case that your down pivot close to where this top pivot is going. The key being is that it's just continuing to decline, and then you get a break above, and that is your first indication that, okay, now no matter where this pivots, it's going to be a higher pivot. So you know that that's going to transition you to an upside move. And the reason we're staying at the left side of this edge is so that we don't see what's happening before it takes place. All right, so you've got a tiny little bit of an up move taking place there. It's a little choppy, but here becomes your first pivot. And that happens to represent at a higher point. Now you're still well below with the green, has not made any move whatsoever from that standpoint. And so your earliest beginnings here are seeing now, this doesn't really qualify as a pivot, even though you do see it moving down. You really need to have a value that changes at least a point. So, or I look for at least 0.5 on the relationship. So negative 1788 to negative 30, right on the edge of that from being a pivot, which that's fine. Worth noting, the easier way to do it in this particular case is to look for the break above, and now you know you're going to end up with a higher pivot again. So you're a slight divergence here to the downside, and lo and behold, it turns around rather quickly from that set. Now you have a higher pivot, clearly defined from the previous one, because there was no pivot here. Green is rising, elevating, so that definitely becomes a buy configuration. Get a little choppiness within there, but then it turns around, finally achieve a pivot here. Now you have no control over how often these pivot. You have no control over the direction that they're going to go. All you can do is see their utilization. And you can see that even within this pivot, it's coming back down to this area. And that expresses a little bit of weakness. If we were to draw this line, continue it across here, just like so. Just a fraction under. But the gist of it is still the same. That once it's below there, you can see that the price was a little bit weak and then moves back above, and you get an exaltation of price going forward. We haven't seen that move yet from the green here. Seems to be just a little bit lower. In fact, now it makes another pivot. So you had this wonderful divergence to the upside. Well, unfortunately, it's ended there, because now you've created a distinctly lower pivot in both green and in the steel. You would expect this to begin to move lower. And lo and behold, goes higher on you. But that only typically lasts for a bar or two. Gives you a general clue as to you're a little early on the situation in general. Something you have to expect. You're not going to always see an immediate reaction. And that would be perfectly normal. And we can go across it. We can see that it's continuing to make lower pivots. Subsequently, though, you're breaking up past where you were, so you would have to be a little bit more cautious to your upside by placing your stop just above those highs. We can see now that a new pivot has been created that is on the upside of it, but you would need to see a move back above there, because you're getting no increase in pivots at all from your green in this particular case. Nothing happening at all. Now we would get our normal buy signal here. You've exceeded this. You begin to see your green moving above. And then finally you get a pivot at a higher level, which would indicate that you would expect an up move from there. So even though our initial buy signal would have popped up here with our yellow candle, which represents the green moving above the red and the white, you may have seen a situation where the red and the white in this particular case were moving lower. And in that particular case, it's fine. It's just a representation that you might be able to get a little bit better price. And there it begins. Gentle ascension. And you can see now, unfortunately, didn't take long. Made a pivot to the upside right here, and then boom, it is pivoted down. Your green is pivoted higher, so you've got a little bit of a divergence there. The steel, however, a little bit stronger to the upside. So in this particular case, you would set a very tight stop, a little more aggressive. You would think about preparing to have a short setup if you get any further breakdown in the green. At a minimum, if you move higher from here, you've created a divergence at this particular level. And it becomes key, because on a secondary sell signal, that becomes your target going back. And you can see it didn't take long for the continuation breakdown. So you didn't get a move back above. It actually continued to break down. And likewise, you ended up with another pivot on the green for lower. So pretty close to about the exact same equivalent. You had a little bit of the divergence going up. Caused your heart to flutter just a little bit. And that's why, because it was about to give you a very nice return to the downside. And likewise, again, from these green pivots, you can see nothing here, continuing lower. You'd be looking very closely now that you've got this pivot. up here, you would just want to extend the line going straight across and following it. And now you can see the price, not relevant to what we're looking at from our lines here. We're not really paying attention to that. You do see that it's broken above there, which is a warning to you, because now you know that you're going to get a higher pivot for a long side move, and you're seeing green moving ahead of it. Pivot takes place, comes down. Perfect. So now you've created a situation where you're now pivoting at the same spot. This definitely has to be more bullish configuration at this particular point. And then you get something like this. It's not a pivot. If we look at the values on it, you got 1153 and 1138. It's not really it's just kind of flat across. So it's kind of just an irregular movement. And it really kind of allows for a reset of the parameters. It's important because you're going to come across those and they just don't have any. Now you're really kind of looking at a divergence, because at this particular point, price should be heading a little bit higher, if not better so, and you're not getting that. It's just pretty much maintaining a flatness, even though now you've created another higher pivot from your green as well. The problem with that is it dipped immediately below, just like that. But lo and behold, you get a slight turnaround that you create a higher pivot at this particular point. So while this one didn't work out and it just turned out flat, needless to say, you ended up with this slightly higher pivot. In fact, that should actually be green. And you have the higher pivot here. So you could have used that green right there. And can you jump into these directly? Sure. You know that you're going to face a little bit of upside down either direction going forward, and the clear signal becomes waiting for like this, where you have the clear upside pivot at that particular point. Now you have your pivot right here, so you'd be looking for the green to break above that to give you a clear indication that you're going to get some kind of solid momentum out of it. In this particular case, it finally breaks over here. Now, also another feature, if you're drawing these, you can always right-click them and just create a new parallel. And it just creates a new one that you can move wherever you like. And that becomes a nice little, you just click one end of it to straighten them out, just like that, or extend it out further. And you can slide them between places. So you could put that one right there and say, okay, yeah, I'm looking for that to move above there. But oh no, it didn't. It just created a lower pivot. And so what you can do is you just slide that one to the next spot and say, okay, as long as I stay below that level. Here you had a slightly higher pivot though, so you've got a little bit of a divergence between what the green and the steel are promoting, which means that you have to be a little more vigilant with your stops. And that's typically all that really means for it. Coming across here, and again, we get another one of these no pivot setups. That's just blasé. This is not of a tilt, none of enough of a dip anywhere. So you had your little bit of a divergence where you had your upside pivot here. We ended up moving a little bit lower. So you know that you're likely to see a return back up to where that divergence is. And so in this particular case, steel on top, a little bit of momentum to the downside before turning around. You can also see that if we created another parallel here, we could bring that down. And if I make it straight, that would help. A fraction too far. Oh my goodness, I'm going to get my mouse control. There we go. So you ended up with another pivot down here, which was a legitimate one. And then boom, it was this bar right here where it broke above it. Right about there, just shy of what you were expecting anyway from the divergence on the move back up anyway. And then lo and behold. So you end up with pretty much just a fractionally higher pivot with the steel right there. Did break immediately below your setup, but you also have higher pivot going on there. So you're looking for that to be maintained, but then it's just a matter of time waiting for another pivot to go. And you're going to get that in kind of what I call flat areas, transitional zones. And again, it's just a matter of you can just elevate. In this particular case, you're seeing progressively lower green pivots going through that's helped maintain while you're getting kind of nothing from your steel. At the same time, this becomes a bullish one, clearly higher than the previous pivot. At that particular point, green has just made a single pivot at this spot. You would be looking for that to break above this particular level. It does so on the very next bar, which also coincidentally becomes a yellow candle, which is where you're going to see some of those, and they should correspond to those positive movements. This will also be a key in seeing which ones are the ones that are likely not to have as much momentum. So parallel moves there, we can look at what those values were. 536, 537, just by one, but clearly the green higher pivot, no question about that one being a move above. And you can kind of see there's the downside to the pivot, but you can go to that previous one, move it up there, and you can see it immediately comes down below it. And then now you've created a definite lower pivot there. But now if you continue with your upside from the green, you can mark this as a divergence point right away. It's also an area where you'd have to be thinking, wow, the stop needs to be in place, because then you can have a situation just like that, where the lower one finally took over once the green broke below, because at this particular point we had the lower pivot. Though the green was higher, it had already broken below where that previous pivot was. And so these lines become very effective in showing you some of those locations. And we can scroll across and we can just do this ad infinitum without a question. So you knew that from the point that this broke out right over here, that even though you dipped, you were more likely than not looking at any kind of divergence if you were going lower, because you just already created a pivot right here. And then finally you get the clear delineation above this level. Now you'll notice that these didn't get above the 13.5 to cause the flip, so not in the same category. And if we draw that line going across, which we could do easily, when the next pivot gets created, this one was a little bit higher, breaks above it right here, and lo and behold, you get the same signal. And you can see that we had the lowering signal from the green, while this was sort of neutral, gives you your little heads up. And so utilizing the two in that kind of symbiotic relationship gives you a better idea. But just a nice feature to give you the same concept. Nothing's changed with these algorithms, but just having the visual display of them in this way gives a little bit easier to recognize it. Don't want to go on too long with this one, so what I'll do is I'll save 50,000 tick, broader time frame, same kind of configurations, same setups. We can do the exact same things with the lines, following them across. I think I even marked in here with the gray box, moving above the 13.5, even though it was deteriorating, it's still bullish. You also had your upper pivots with green at this particular point on rising, and that caused it to improve. And then again, another higher pivot, so you would expect that that was going to continue for just a little bit until you develop your lower setup, which was coming, but it looks like it broke all the way back up very quickly. And that's going to happen, but you get your little muck areas, but overall, bar or two is typically about the extent that you would look down a 50,000 tick. That's a lot more time than it is on a 5,000. Worth looking at for those of you with the indicators, because it would definitely enhance your ability to stick with the trade and make some of those runs last a little bit longer, and also understand why some of them reverse so quickly. It's literally that moving dynamic of the market. As always, though, continue to look for additional advanced studies on the DOC as well as the paint bars. Trade well.